Okay. Okay. So hello, this is CUDAN Open Lab seminar on March 24, 2025. Basically, spring is about to begin. And today it's our greatest pleasure to have Marta Bertolaso from Università Campus Bio-Medico di Roma, talking about global biodata governance, epistemic and ethical issues enhancing human rights, flourishing, and prosperity. We're very much looking forward to this. And we have another Roman in 2 weeks, which is great. Like we had one last week. So the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this lab seminars. It's a pleasure. I know that probably my background is different from the background of many of you. Still, I think that these are very interdisciplinary topics, so I'm really grateful to have a real discussion on to move forward with different agendas. I guess we have at the local level, at the different national, but even international. And now with the geopolitical scenarios, I think it's very much needed, right? To share viewpoints, insights, real problems, and to find out possible common solutions. So that's what I expect actually from these hours. I know that we can use these hours as we want. I prefer to use the collective viewpoint since the very beginning. So given my different background, probably it will be better for me starting with at least half an hour presenting my way of framing, thinking, and working in this field. I would like let me say that feel free to interrupt at any time if there are clarificatory questions, right? If you are missing me, what I'm saying, or I'm speaking too slow or too fast or whatever, it's important to have a real conversation. And maybe at some point we can just open up the discussion and continue sharing viewpoints using the rest of the time we have. So, okay, so clearly. The first point I wanted to make explicit is my background, a methodological, let me say, a methodological, right, rationale for this presentation, because I want to focus on technical aspects of the different norms we have. I want to focus on very technical aspects of AI or digital tools in these scenarios. What I'm interested in is mainly the why is in fact the case that we do have a social problem. The thesis I support all the time is that also the technical problems we have are at the end of the day social problems. And in that sense, also ethical problems. But of course, we have science and we have technology. And I also think that when we use and rely upon science, scientific knowledge in a responsible way, it's much easier to converge and to find ways to manage the challenges we are dealing with, and also to find sustainable solutions, because that's the other problem I'm really interested in, right? We are implementing technical solutions, and for today, the problem is managing biodata. But technical solution without a deeper understanding of what we are actually dealing with. So in this case, biodata, it's almost impossible, I think, to realize, to enhance sustainable innovation, sustainable processes, sustainable solutions. And the reasons are not only ethical in the sense of the good, right, we pursue with this solution, but also is a scientific problem related with a deeper understanding of what a biodata is, the value, the epistemological value of biodata. And I will try to stress this point because I think this might be one of the main contribution I can give in this contest, given your backgrounds. Well, as far as I learned or read in these days about your wonderful work. So, okay, I think that the methodological premises are always important. So the next question is, what are we talking about? And this is a slide. You can Google it. You can find it. This is not a case study for me. It's just a picture I've got from internet. So, but useful enough, I think, to make clear what we are talking about when thinking in terms of biobanks. There is a social need and a framing the question in terms of needs always frame, right, the question in terms of a challenge, not only for lawyers, not only for citizens, not only for scientists, but also for engineers. For, of course, for ICT people, for data analysts, and so on. So it's this is also why it is and will remain a social issue. At this point, I already prefer to shift the term. As you can see, I don't like the term problem. I prefer challenge or issue, right? Why? Because yeah, I think that there is a bias in the notion of problem. When we think of in terms of problems, we usually look for unique, optimized solutions because of theoretical paradigms we have inherited. I won't have time to expand on this, but I think it's much more interesting framing the questions in terms of challenges, of which also means issues, but also opportunities, and so on. Okay, sorry, but for a philosopher, words are important. So I will stress different terms, and I will ask you help for other terms, maybe, and notions. Anyway, so
I have
here,
a question.
sorry, Maximilian?
Yeah, I have a question regarding this. So issue
Yeah.
was, there's issue tracking systems. So it was about 25 years ago when sort of like we didn't write problems down in IT, but we basically recorded issues. And certain companies were very, very keen on not calling it problem. Is there a relation to that, or does it go the other way around? Like, did philosophy come up with this first, or is it something coming out of the IT industry, sort of being allergic to being shaded by calling it problem, basically?
No, well, I don't probably know enough of what you are referring to, but I'm not surprised because I'm not surprised. And I think that there are different reasons why this is the case. To the bottom line, in a didactical way, I would say that we we were born, right, within a technocratic, maybe reductionist cultural environment where everything seemed to be possible just on the basis of more data or more money or right, and science understood as a field of the human endeavor in which we can get at some point to a certain final answer. too complex problems, too complex issues. And now I think that we are suffering this tension. Some societies, some people in society are still looking for certainties in that old paradigm, and other people are instead aware that we are facing the real complexity of the natural world, which include, of course, artificial intelligence, I would say, because it's a human product. And anything related with living beings is complex, intrinsically complex. So we cannot reduce this kind of the knowledge, the kind of data we get out of that world without losing the perspective, and therefore probably the sense, the relevance of the results we can generate through technology as well. So I know that this is a complex answer again, but hope enough to clarify my viewpoint. Yeah, I think that for engineers, let's let's think of engineers 20 or 50 years ago, right? The framework was give me a problem, I'll offer you the best optimized solution. And we were looking for final solutions. And now, after COVID, at least, it's clear that things are much more complex, right? And to me, this is a issue related with the very a deeper understanding of life, of living systems, and not merely mechanical system. And the statement is also that we cannot reduce living systems to mechanical systems either. So we need to manage in a completely different way. We are working with colleagues on this notion, ideas of governance in complexity, not governance of complexity, right? So I have a couple of slides by the end of the presentation precisely on this point. If I hope this is enough for now regarding the question problem versus issues. When we use the issues, we can look at things in a wider way. I think the mindset is different. The mindset is different. So, and here, when talking about biobanks, I think this is very much needed because we are dealing since the very beginning of the process with live biological samples. Okay, I'll go back to this point. So we collect biodata, which means nowadays two things. Till 10 years ago, I think the term of biobanks was related with the physical biological samples. Now it's clear that when talking about biobanks, we are talking about physical samples, but also digital information about those samples. So, or generated through on the basis of those samples. So, and this is adding an important level of research, inquiry, possibility, understanding, everything. Okay. Of course, we need the consent of the donors, right? So in different countries, the question is, who is the first question is, who is the owner of that sample of those data? Of course, this is not enough because we need patient engagement, but we also need the adequate infrastructure to manage those sample with all the problems related with privacy and data protection and so on. Probably here there are experts about this, so I will focus more on, again, frameworks and socio-technical issues, right? Okay, and there is also an issue related with the value of the information we are collecting in those biobanks. There are different kinds of biobanks. These are always images borrowed by in Google, Google Images actually. So there are biobanks related with cells, organoids, blood, tissue, population, digital biobanks, and so on. There are companies. I'm working with some companies that are developing tech insurances. So there is also a new generation of insurances related with this kind of material. If anybody is interested in this, I can say something more later. And of course, there are institutions at the local, global level very interested in the governance and in the management of this biodata. One example is clearly personalized medicine, precision medicine, this kind of language we use anytime we want to cure or care a specific, usually chronic diseases or systemic diseases, like cancer is neurodegenerative diseases, immuno-related stories, diseases, and so on, right? So again, there is a different, new important dimension of this biodata governance we cannot ignore. There are different, not only technical, not only legal, but I would say more in deep, right, epistemological issues. When I use I know that when we speak in English, epistemological stories sounds much more familiar. When I use this word in Italy, in Italian, or in Spanish, I do have problems because people usually don't understand what I'm talking about. So to be didactic, sorry again, but epistemology is related with the way we know things, right? How we generate, how we reach some kind of not only information, but understanding of things we are looking at, we are doing research on, right? And okay, so why are we working so hard? Because I know, right? You also probably know that there are research groups. Many of you might be involved too in national, international groups working on this kind of topics. Because it's clear that we have many opportunities. We have great technologies, mainly digital technologies, to deal, to manage this kind of scenarios. Still, there is a question about ourselves. Why are we collecting biodata? To what extent should we rely upon the information scholars, engineers, people in the biobanks, for example, what kind of knowledge, right, they can generate from my data, from that sample I gave years ago? To what extent we can use collective data for the good of a specific society, of somebody, right? Of that specific person, because that specific individual has that specific disease, right? Think of rare diseases, for example, right? In this case, it's fundamental to have data, to have to get access to this kind of knowledge. Different countries have adopted different strategies. You know that UK, I think that to some extent has leading the way, right, in the use and collection of this data since ever, I would say. I know more about cancer, about the neoplastic diseases, but now it's a trend. In Italy, we have been working within the ministries, to bring the biotech um, industries, initiatives, whatever, right, within the bioeconomy area. I know that in the north of Europe, this was already the case, um, at least for the last 5, maybe even more years. So again, the strategy is different, but it is not neutral. That's my point, right? It's not neutral. If we consider biotech within a bioeconomy scenario, if we limit biotech to the healthcare processes, human healthcare processes, so not directly linking, for example, these issues to the environment, to the One Health language, right? So animals, plants, environment, humans, and so on. All these are choices. It's not by chance. It's not by chance that we organize also the different fields of innovation under different umbrellas. So what all these scenarios have in common, at least in the Occidental world countries, is nevertheless a question about where are we. While some people are stressed or concerned about the collection of biodata, about the sharing of biodata, and how and why we are struggling so hard. I followed the discussion during the G7 or G20 during the last 2 years, right? So it was clear that it's not easy at all to converge on a common idea of how we could manage biodata for the common good, and what is a common good, right? How should we understand the very notion of common good, and what's the role of the digital technologies in this scenario? Okay, first an answer from my side, from my work related with mainly an ethical, socio-ethical viewpoint, right? This is not to go back to the evolution, but just to say this slide is just to say that human beings are naturally technical. So we have been dwelling in the real world since ever through, and thank you, and yeah, adopting, developing technologies from the will to the artificial intelligence. So we have been accelerating this process, and clearly the process of automation, which is something we are looking for when adopting artificial intelligence technologies, also generated this sense of stress, mainly, right? But there are values that are mediated by this idea of autonomy, which is something good, which is something still good, something also related with another A. These are the 4A. I usually say the 4A of the transition or digital transformation, right? So automation, acceleration, clearly, accessibility, which is another value, right? And good. But the question is, in my opinion, about autonomy, because this explains, in my opinion, many of the tensions that arise in this kind of, when thinking, for example, in terms of biodata and governance of biodata. Why I'm questioning this term, which is clearly related with the human rights? Because we, through technologies, during the last 2 centuries at least, we have let's think now of the companies, let's think of the industries, let's think of the street, right? What happens outside there? The kind of expectations that have been created when talking about new technologies. Think of automation processes, but much more in concrete of a computer, of iPhone, smartphones, and so on, iPad and MP3 when we used them for a very few years, right? The idea was that mainly I was able to offer people in autonomy in communicating, autonomy in solving problems, autonomy in reaching out or looking for information, and so on. The outcome, again, especially this is something very clear in the sociology, right? In the sociological studies, the outcome has been quite often an individualistic society. So everybody was looking, is probably in some context still looking for his or her own autonomy. And that's, to me, the tension, the philosophical, anthropological, ethical question related with why are we so stressed and worried about digital technologies? Why are we so worried about the possibility of collecting, managing, sharing data in general, and even more biodata? The first answer from my side is we have probably forgotten that the main idea of a human being, what our happiness, flourishing, prosperity is up to, is not individualistic. We are much more happy, we are much more free, we experience much more satisfaction, human satisfaction, when we can do a lot of things, we can automate things, but for something we can do and share in common. So a relational understanding of living, of human beings and of societies more in general, I think is important, something which the young generation already experience, although they don't know how quite often, right? How to get the most out of these possible scenarios where the we is much more important than the I or my. And that's, to me, important. It's probably clarify also some scientific evidences I will share in a while. Before getting to that point, a few slides that might be trivial for some of you, but hopefully not from a philosophical, again, epistemological point of view, because if I have been questioning what society, right, what human beings, and to some extent I already said that when looking at biodata, I have to take into account that the bio dimension does not allow to create mechanistic solutions to use an epistemology of certainties, because the real natural biological world has an intrinsic complexity, which asks for an epistemology of uncertainty, not of certainty. So what we have to do is not looking for final certainties, but to manage uncertainties. A biodata is never related with one final result, and therefore information. When I get the sequence of my DNA, not necessarily, I don't necessarily have more information about myself, right? There are different level of analysis. There are data that are not final under any respect. And mainly all the biological data need a contextualized interpretation.
Mm.
This this is a challenge for data analysts, for ICT people, because the kind of constraints I need to put and to include in my algorithms are not cannot be taken for granted, right? It's a human effort, it's a human endeavor, it's real research trying to figure out what are the constraints I have to put in those specific algorithms in order to get to reliable and relevant from a scientific point of view results. And I also know that I need, I'm adding some examples to explain what I'm thinking of, right? And to bring things closer to our daily life. But when I'm training an algorithm, for example, for data recognition in radiotherapy, in the radiotherapy field area, clearly I need to train and train again the algorithms and to continue that process almost every day, at least every week, in my experience in my hospital, because that there is that famous effect, right, of semantic decay, decadimento semantico in Italian, of the algorithms. So the use of the machine is important, and we can go back to the training of the machine once the machine has been used or is used. So this is important. This is clearly up to human beings. It's not something that a machine alone can do, not even, and even less, I would say, generative AI, because they use the sources they already know, right? This is something that is probably very well known mm, for you all. So what's my point here? Saying that first ontology, then ethics, right? That the point is that, in my opinion, asking ethical question before questioning what kind of technology we are dealing with, what kind of human understanding of those technology is possible and is relevant, is misleading. Some philosophers even claimed that artificial intelligence does not exist. Okay, I know that for scientists and for ICT people, this is absurd, right? It's a paradox, it's something stupid. But from a philosophical point of view, it is not. Why? Because anytime we are talking about artificial intelligence, digital tools, we are assuming that there are human beings dealing, managing, creating, maintaining them. So it's not a problem that we are always to some extent better than machines. This is not the case. We are building and developing machines, AI, digital tools precisely to go beyond our limits. Still, we have a role. There is something specifically human in all and any digital process. So that's why I think that it's important to think of artificial intelligence devices or digital processes, not in terms of artificial intelligence, which philosophically is, I we can also say, a category mistake. We won't have time to go deeper in this point, but what's interesting for us probably is sharing this idea. Instead of using AI, is better to talk in terms of the ecosystem. So we are delegating control, the ecosystem, right? Delegating control systems. So the question is, what are we actually delegating? You know probably this statement, so I can move faster on these points. this is the idea, right? All these possibilities we have, machine learning, deep learning, assisted, these different terms we are using to refer to some extent to the same kind of devices. I think that at the end of the day, the most adequate is a delegated control system, because in this way, the focus is pretty much on decisions, on what what kind of decisions we are delegated, why, to what extent can we delegate, right? So this also means moving to DECO systems, also means thinking not of technical systems with the social consequences. So the ethical question comes at the end of the story. We develop a project, and at the end of the story, we ask the ethical question, but the ethical question, the social question, is at the very beginning. It's much more relevant, I think, thinking in terms of system as technically implemented social systems. We have social systems made by machines and human beings that are technically implemented. This also means that to my students, I always say that what a trivial, obvious consequence is that what is artificial in those systems is not intelligent, and what is intelligent is not artificial, right? This is a way, in my opinion, to disentangle also the ambiguity or the tensions, at least at the social communication ethical level, that the very term of artificial intelligence can generate. And instead to invest and develop these kind of technologies that are very important, in my opinion, and very much needed in the scenarios we are facing with. So these are a couple of slides to say something you probably teach better than me. So different definitions of intelligence. I won't spend time on this, but this is instead important, right? That, for example, this is another reason why I prefer not using the term of problem, right? Because when artificial intelligence, when I ask a computer to solve or to help me with the problem I have with maths at school, the machine is really able to help me, but the problem remains human. And depending on how I frame the problem, the machines can help me in different ways. And that's part of the most interesting challenging we are facing with. Also in the biodata, similarly, we can say that intelligence is related with understanding, but in this sense, we understand not the machines. Intelligence as a problem solving, we have problems, not the machines. And we can simulate everything, but simulating is related with being and not performance, functional performance. Why I think this is so important to put ontology first. Ontology here is not in the sense that use ICT people, right? It's in the philosophical sense. What we are talking about, what are we looking, what are we looking at? And this is important because this is particularly important for biodata, right? All dynamic action or action of brute force takes place between two subjects. But by semiosis, I mean, on the contrary, an action or influence which is or involves a cooperation of three subjects, such as a sign, an object, and an interpretant. This free relative influence not being in any way resolved into action between pairs. So the point is, although, or even more, when we work with artificial intelligence, with algorithms, with data, the interpretant is important. And this has implication in the terms I create an algorithm, but also how I can use that specific algorithms. Yes, please, Maximilian.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point of discussion. I don't know if this leads too far, but I think we should probably
Yes.
pick it later. One of the interesting things is that AI systems often are talked to in terms of stimulus and response. We train them by showing them stuff, and then they spit out some vectors or some concepts. And in the same way, you could sort of like turn this around, right? Like sort of like their output is our input, and we put something out. So in that sense, any conversation sort of like has this sort of like Persian triad in there. But what is like what I think he's critiquing, he's sort of cutting off the
Yeah.
connection between the sign and the object. And that only works via the interpretant. So in some sense, the question is not only do you need the interpretant, but is there something without interpretation, basically? Like, does the sign and the object even exist if there's no cognitive agent who both perceives and acts, while the actual conversation happens in the cognitive agent? And I think that is sort of like a really interesting question, because artificial intelligence is typically not doing that. Like we actually give it a stimulus and we get some response. And yes, there's something happening, but sort of the self-drivenness is sort of like the question is that becoming true, and then what's happening? In the last 2 weeks, we had, or 3 weeks, we had 2 talks, which were using artificial intelligence agents, large language models, as social agents and have them talk to each other. And there you get like consequences, which seem a lot like they're functional in a sense, while at the same time, they raise all these questions that you sort of like bring in. For example, they all adopt a male gender for 2 weeks, and then the conversation is more female, and then it's more male again. And already the question, like, what does that even mean? Because that too was a classification problem, probably. And
Yeah.
so how do we maybe to put it very simple, how can we bring Charles Peirce up to speed into a world where complexity is sort of like the core notion of social interaction, where there's multiple agents, when he's only talking about one interpretant and an object and a sign?
Yeah. Yeah, as always, great questions, right? If anybody wants to jump into the conversation discussion, please feel free. I have my thoughts and answers, but yeah, I'm also happy to listen. So my point is that this will be always the case, because the very nature of artificial intelligence is precisely like that, right? So they are able to work and to generate even what we can call social agents. And again, you see, the words are important, right? If we call them social agents, we are calling them social agents like we use artificial intelligence language to stress the fact that they are not that they are interacting as they were human beings, but because human beings are interacting with those machines as if they were human beings, right? So this is already a choice. Of course, if we are in a society of stupid people, which is in fact the case in some contexts, unfortunately, right? They can be manipulated. They can be clearly manipulated by this kind of social agents. And the effect we already know, and that was expected, predicted, right, is a strong, heavy homogenization of communities, of societies, of of networks, right, of communities,
Yeah.
which is in fact a risk, and which is also a reality.
So,
Manipulation. Sorry, please.
no, go ahead.
Okay.
I, there's one interesting point here is that we're and this is sort of like in the nature of the discussion, right? We're talking biodata, which is taken from humans. Healthcare is, I don't know, a huge chunk of sort of like the research ecosystem, focusing on humans due to sort of like healthcare reasons. While now there is this artificial intelligence coming in, but if you look at like over the last 30 years in complexity science, thinking about social interaction, there has been a huge sort of like focus in areas such as evolutionary game theory, such as social network analysis, such as systems design, where people look at actually rather stupid agents. Like sometimes you have agent-based models where the agents is really not much more than a cellular automaton,
Yeah.
where you pull in three numbers and you get something out. And then having that play out already gives you complex results. And then in nature, there are things what E.O. Wilson calls sort of like if we think we are cognitive altruists, like we choose to be altruistic, he has this concept of instinctive altruism, which you find in ants and in termites and in brine shrimp and in mole rats. And obviously, if you think about computers doing stuff and you give them a little bit more intelligence than sort of like a cellular automaton, then I think 5 to 10 years ago, we would have put them in that category. We would say, I was like, yeah, they're designed to do certain things. And then now here, it's a question is like, there is now indeed even religions being founded around these supposed general artificial intelligence agents, where that very much assume there is some kind of cognitive
Yeah.
notion going on. The word altruism is used in very weird ways in this kind of community, but that there's a sort of like really interesting things. Like, do you think we should expand, or would it be worthwhile to expand that philosophical frame, or should we just stay with this sort of like AI and humans? Or is there a point where we should call in the cavalry of people who worked with Brian Sharp, works with ants and so on for a very long time?
No, thank you for this. Yeah, new question, because my short answer from a philosophical point of view and even an ethical point of view, I don't like the language of social agents for machines.
Yeah.
As I don't like, I like in the street, in the cartoons, but I don't like in the legal, for example, right? Just merely talking about artificial intelligence. Those are still machines.
Yes.
They are good, very good, excellent, and they will be better and better. And I have no problem with the possibilities these machines have to simulate human behaviors,
Mhm.
individual or collective behaviors.
Mhm.
It's up to us training them, right? Or putting those machines, I'm thinking of generative AI, right? Putting those machines, or deep learning mainly, because that's the basic technology, but putting them in the condition to learn from the behavior of real human beings. Okay.
Mhm.
I have no problem at all. And they will help probably to many extent. But what I'm worried about is I'm more worried about human beings. I'm not worried about artificial intelligence. I'm worried about human stupidity in dealing with these machines, because
Mhm.
which is the philosophical point. I'm using stupid in philosophical term, right? I don't want it to be trivial, but is I really think that we are missing a huge opportunity of understanding something more, something very important of us, of human beings, individually and collectively, if we
Mhm.
compare ourselves with machines. And this is in fact the trend. We are
Okay.
stressing this kind of, right, of sorry, you were saying something.
Yeah, I think what is quite interesting is like you're sitting in Rome, right? And so there's this tradition in the Catholic Church of at the same time creating idols and sort of like having this whole um uh making idolatry, like sort of like basically giving sculptures agency or stuff like that. sort of like considering that to be sort of like the ultimate sacrilege against God, basically. Now, one of the interesting things that happens, and I think this is sort of something we should bring into this discussion, because we're not talking just artificial intelligence in the way AI researchers would understand it. In a broader governance circumstance, you can see all the hallmarks of idolatry, right? So like my favorite example is Sophie the robot, which is basically an animatronic puppet that simulates sort of like human expression enriched with some kind of, obviously now ever more large language model, whatever, but giving that robot a driver's license in Saudi Arabia months before women were allowed to drive, that is a massive philosophical fallacy in a sense, right? Because obviously there is like huge implications that have absolutely zero to do with the fact if this machine is functional, how it functions, and so on. Because, it's like, I mean, we have self-driving trains for a really long time, and they don't get a quote-unquote driver's license on their track. And we would probably, some trains literally have googly eyes in front, but that doesn't make them more sort of like, they don't get like human rights or something like, or the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution wouldn't apply to them and stuff like that. While this is sort of like done, and then the question, indeed, and I share this very much with you, is like, do we really sort of like, is there an erosion of human rights if we do stuff like that, basically?
Yeah.
And should we go down that road?
Look, I really think that if we don't take seriously the philosophical, anthropological, ethical, social challenges posed by this kind of machines, which is good, we are missing an opportunity. And that's the sin. The technology, of course, I'm in Rome and I know and I appreciate, I'm Catholic, right? So I'm also looking at things from that point of view. But science and technology have been flourishing within the Catholic and Christian traditions. So it's not a problem developing technology. That's why I started since the very beginning says that human beings are naturally technical, right? The problem is, and idolatry, I think, is precisely when we give up with our human decisions, not using that tool or that the other one, but when we give up with our responsibility in making decision for our lives and for the common good. Because those decisions, and you were using, and that was interesting to me, right? In the first question, you were using the term of when we create an algorithm, right? When we put an algorithm in a machine, we need to cut, right? To decide what is in and what is out of that algorithm. And cutting is precisely the etymology of the verb making decision. Decidere in Latin means cutting. And human beings cut not on the basis of inferential reasoning, not on the basis of correlation patterns, right? We make decisions on the basis of values all the day. And that's why human beings are also doing all the time stupid things from a mechanical point of view, from a mechanistic point of view, for the good of a person I have close to me, right? Think of a mother with her child, right? Or of a person in the street crossing and seeing that something is happening and doing stupid mechanical things, so hurting himself, herself to save or for the sake of somebody else, right? So that's why we have been flourishing as a human society and why that we have been creating stronger social bonding when this was the case. If we don't use a machine in the same logic, within the same framework, we will end up missing ourselves and we will surprised one day looking around and say, we are all machines and we won't survive because it's not sustainable. That was my point, even from a point of view of the marketing of these devices, right? It's not sustainable because human beings are much more, that's again a flourishing prosperity, right? Human flourishing, human prosperity is, we need the others. It's and machines, if they help us, that's fine. But they have to mediate, intermediate as far as we want our communication, our sharing,
Mhm.
but not substituting our fundamental decisions. And that's why I'm not in favor of multiplying, for example, rights when coming to artificial intelligence. So different rights, right, depending on the different technological scenarios. I think it's much more important and urgent nowadays to go deeper in the basic human rights. Also because the technology will change. It's moving faster and faster. So we will always running after something if we are not able to create to work on general principles. That was my point at the G7, right? Working at the general principles and enhancing, allowing, helping communities to take locally responsible and prudent decisions. Wisdom, wisdom, I think is very much needed because the decisions will be more and more very local. And in the biology, in the biomedical field, this is absolutely evident because the scientific weight, I would say, right? The scientific weight of that information, the information embedded in that piece of or a sample, blood sample or DNA or whatever, right? Pretty much depend on what I want to do. What is the outcome? What is the concern? What is the risk? Think in terms of how how should we think in terms of risk evaluation, risk assessment, and even risk management when dealing with this kind. We do need a new generation of scientific leaders. I'm calling them scientific leaders able to trained, adequately trained in understanding, of course, technological issues. They have to know how it works, how those machines work, but also trained in epistemology, in philosophy and ethics, right? So really able to clarify what's the question, what are we actually aiming at? It's much easier
So
to converge.
there's I like to bring in another word which is very close to decidere, which is discretion, right? Which is also discredere, is another form of like cutting the world into pieces. And one of the interesting things is that computer science, digital 01, that's discrete, is sort of like complementary to what's going on in biology because that's, yes, genes may be this, you may call them discrete, but there is a lot of stuff going on in biology that is happen in fluids and so on. So there's definitely continuous humoral, as Neumann would have said, and also sort of like discrete components in there. And if you have a lot of zeros and ones, then also this behaves not in the classic way a philosophical ontology would work, where you would have, sort of public and private or natural and spiritual or whatever. So we're facing this world where we're having an ontology, we're using an ontology, we're further developing an ontology, not only in philosophy, also the computer sciences students and the public does that, right? By calling it either artificial intelligence or machine learning, or let's call it big data or large data. So, there's just
Correct.
go to Amazon, you will find different books if you look at these two diagrams. One of the interesting things about this is that underlying this, there's a much more complex and complicated world going on. And if you think about systems biologists who work about protein interaction and protein sequencing or microbiomic analysis or whatever. I mean, they don't need this type of an ontology because they have a much more complex picture going on, which is at the same time more detailed, more granular, but also much more rigorous. So there's no, you don't have a debate about what P56 is. It's a protein, you measure it, and it has a particular structure, and that's it. And so it's countable and so on, right? But then the same problem is the measurement itself is so messy that then, what does that even mean, basically, right? Do you capture every instance of it in the cell, or is there too much other stuff in the way to actually count everything and so on? So what I'm after here is like natural science has this much more mathematical, quantitative, you could also say physical way of dealing with sort of like the object that we're trying to understand and try to track, because it's highly dynamic too, while at the same time, governance, legal systems, philosophy, humanities about it, and also in some way, how newspapers, feuilletons, and so on work, because they're typically humanists doing this kind of thing. We are not at that same level, right? Like there's this sort of like back and forth, and now we have these new interfaces, which are, you could, for example, have a large language model sort of like translating for regular people what the systems biologists do, but then you have this problem that the data in between is really, really shitty, and right, patient data is notoriously bad because people measure when they have a problem. And here I very, very explicitly use the word problem, while the issue is not tracked in a comprehensive manner, right? So that is sort of something which is, I think, a really, really difficult problem. How do we have the voices of the people who sort of deal with these other modes, dealing with figure visualizations, measurements, differential equations, and get a better understanding of these systems? How do we bring that to a broader audience? Is that something where artificial intelligence, for example, can help? Or is it actually more standing in the way of having a better understanding in the broader public? Shouldn't we teach network science, discrete versus continuous quantification, fluid dynamics to kids in school in a different way? That, when I went to school, you could learn this, but it was not obligatory for everybody. And now I think there is this sort of huge spat of people who are interested. Like in Italy, there's lots of really amazing complex system scientists. Like it's really one of the countries where complexity science is sort of like, very much on the forefront, and also sort of like people have a consciousness for it, similar to architectural history. Like everybody has books in their shelves, even though they're not architectural historians, while at the same time, the broader public, just like in every other country, has no idea of, like, when I say the word complex, does it mean headache, or does it mean complicated, or does it mean something very specific, namely that there is some new quality emerging from local granular quantity?
Yeah.
And I think that is sort of like really, really difficult. So where do you see as a philosopher, like the role of philosophy of like mitigating this issue, and B, is there is there something that philosophy can bring to the table, and where do you think is philosophy standing in the way because there is a completely different mode of knowledge and knowing and analysis going on?
Yeah. Yeah, wonderful. This would deserve much more than a seminar. But if I can say something, I think that the role of philosophy nowadays is in helping people, scientists, engineers, ICT people, lawyers, right, to take time to think together and consider things from a wider perspective, which is able to handle at the same time a very practical, pragmatic way of using artificial intelligence without without considering that there is something new to be discovered out there, which won't be up to the machines. It's not a problem of having more data, and it won't be possible to have a comprehensive, unified theory of everything, right? That was a nightmare, I would say, of physicists the last century. And now somebody can think that this will be up to the machines. And this is not the case. Why? Because it's not only a problem of managing the uncertainty generated within or because we have complicated, oh, not complex, right? I'm creating a contrast, uh, systems or situation.
Mhm.
With engineers and modeling things, we are able to come up at some point, right, with a process of refinement, abstraction, and refinement to come up with a model that works.
Mhm.
The question is, why does it work, and in which case, to which extent? Because the answer to this second question is instead very much related with the intrinsic complexity of life, of living beings. We won't be able to reduce in any case. And going back to your example, and here, well, if we want to enter the mathematical and the philosophical, I would say, discussion about what is a discrete, right, element. This is a very important question you asked, I think, important probably for another seminar, but this having distinct and inseparable entities is not a paradox from a philosophical point of view. This is something that engineers, especially engineers, usually resist to understand. To put it simple, and this is a philosophical epistemological endeavor, right? Work, typical job. The point is that let's think in terms of data, right? A data, especially in the biology, and I'll go back to your example of P53, okay?
Mhm.
But a data is always something discrete, but they value in terms of information, even more of understanding related to that data, is heavily dependent on the relationships that specific information has with, for example, the context in which it has been generated. Okay.
Yeah.
So in biology, and I wouldn't say that in biology it's easier, because precisely in the biomedical sciences, that's why I'm so interested in biodata, right? Is paradoxes are emerging. When we talk about P53, what is P53? Because even the notion of a protein is a piece of matter performing a function, basically. Okay.
Mhm.
I give that definition looking at very specific processes. But when you look at P53 behavior, for example, or role, functional role in tumorigenesis,
Mhm.
you have some cases in which P53 is a oncogene, so responsible of the generation of a cancer, and in
Mhm.
other cases, it's a tumor suppressor gene.
Mhm.
So what are we talking about? Should be should we consider a paradox or a mistake, or what is this, right? For a machine, this would be a paradox. For a human being, it is not. Why? Because that specific function of that specific protein depends on the context, on the biological context in which that protein is here and now, right? So it can perform very different functions, and this is commonplace in the biological world. So
There's a very interesting point here, because it's sort of like is in contrast to what you said, like, biological mechanisms, like, or biological function is not mechanistic, which in this particular case I think is a really good example where I think what we should say is like it's if it is mechanistic, it is more opaque and much more complex to observe. Like P53 doing this or that is very similar to, say, like a glass lens, which I can look at a page and enlarge it. That's positive. But I can also take a light and actually burn a hole into what I want to read.
yeah.
And it's the same lens. And there's a similar thing going on. And whoever has seen, like, all the humanists listening to this, and you have never seen it, look at the KEGG map, the human metabolome. These metabolic pathways, they're just massive. I mean, they look like an oil refinery and not like a tiny little machine with a crank which you grind meat with, where you have like simple input, simple output. And I think that is sort of something which is quite interesting, that there's so many factors, so many ingredients, so many functions, so many pathways, that we cannot fully predict what's going on. And even like if you measure, you don't know, like, if you say, oh, I find out in this particular patient, P53 is a suppressor. And then sort of like you may want to use this and upregulate P53. This may actually do something to the function of P53 so the cancer starts to grow. So we don't know, right? And so that is sort of something which I think is quite an interesting thing, because that also puts into question the whole notion of what a biobank is, right? Because
Exactly.
if
Correct.
right,
Correct. Correct.
we're not talking about substance, we're really collecting sort of like samples of function,
Correct.
right?
Yes. Yes. Absolutely yes. And that's my point. But you see that here, uh, I think it's easier to understand why words, narratives,
Mhm.
but also scientific understanding, technological capabilities have to be in dialogue and helping each other to create the adequate images, narratives, terms, in order
Mhm.
to help people to understand what we are actually talking about, and to help scientists to be daring enough mm, to go deeper in what is happening, also within a deep learning machine. Also
Mhm.
within, because I'm pretty sure that this is for future, but I'm pretty sure that we are still talking about artificial intelligence as a tool. Okay. I,
Mhm.
I think that what is happening in those machines will open up a new world for scientific discoveries. They are getting access to different levels, right, of reality, which are always partial as data as data are, and
Mhm.
as all the scientific questions and models are, right? So it's up to human beings, the synthesis. It's up to human being asking the relevant final question to discover new laws, not only correlations. Correlations are not even causal inferences, right? We have to make to bridge the gap. Mm. So this, I think, well, we can say a lot of things on this really on this point, but I do agree. I do agree that especially when talking of biodata and in the biomedical field, this is very important because the risk is to delegate everything to machines without understanding and without really treating patients in an adequate way, or creating expectations that are not fair. Mm? And we have a huge responsibility in this sense. And if people in ICT, data analysts, engineers, mathematicians, and so on can can develop their own arguments to say these things, it will be easier to move forward and even faster in using these kind of technologies, but for the good, right? And not for something which will be misleading. Let me give you an example of why I'm so concerned about this point, right? The I probably have a slide about this. Let me go to that slide. This is the Toy Story effect is precisely what we are talking about, right? If we have time, we can go back to this, but okay.
Yeah, please go on. Like
No,
maybe,
no, but let me follow also your way of reasoning, right? Which is interesting. Okay, this is the slide.
Mhm.
Look, this is a publication in Lancet last year, I think. Okay, and the result of this review was that people are much more willing to share their data, so biodata, for primary use than for secondary use.
Mhm.
If we take seriously what we have been discussing up to now, it's a paradox, isn't it? If primary use means I go to the hospital and the doctors ask me if I want to leave samples data, right, available. In that stage, at that stage, I'm under pressure because I need to be cured.
Mhm.
Okay, so I say yes almost to everybody, right? Because I want to be cured. But the information in those samples is much more, is higher, even higher in terms of weight, right? At that time, then when I give, for example, my consent for secondary use, which means once I leave the hospital, they ask me if I want to leave that material, those data also for research purposes.
Mhm.
Okay. The information in my samples is not so relevant. It's relevant for some very general studies, probably, right? Or it might be relevant for rare diseases, so very specific. But the information in that sample, for example, does not match anymore with my own personal physiological state, for example, metabolic state, going back to your example, right, about metabolism. Why is this the case, right? I think you see that there are psychological, social, but also scientific reasons, because we think that data are me, my DNA, right? It's they cannot even clone Marta if they have my DNA, and we know that on a biological basis, right?
Mhm.
Still, we are struggling with this kind, and so I think that there are paradoxes in our society when coming to these topics, right? So my
Well,
let me say one more thing also for discussion, right? In Italy, and when they ask me in the ministries and with my colleagues discussing these things with ministries here in Italy, my position is that data should, the owners should be the citizens, right? So people should own their own data.
mhm.
But the interfaces, the infrastructures that can manage those data might be, even should be public. for the common good. Okay. And even more, for the G7, we have published a couple of papers. Let me see, because I have slides probably on with that paper. Yes, this is one of those papers. The idea, the suggestion here is to create and enhance work for local communities. We have been using in the last 2 years the language of data cooperatives, which was developed firstly by these guys, so these people mainly. And the idea is, again, working on principles, human rights, fundamental human rights at the higher levels, and helping local communities to take on their own responsibilities in the way they use data for local purposes, and the localities can be at different levels, right? Could be in a village, but could be in a country, could be in a continent, could be at the global, could be at the global. And this should be, or could be, in our vision, helping, right, people going back to their own responsibility and not delegating responsibility to only to doctors, for example. Think of the wars we have in the hospitals, right, when something happens. And so creating and going back and reinforcing social bonding, that's what we need, not trusting machines. That's idolatry, right? When we individually and collectively prefer to leave machines decide for us. Definitely, Christianity is not about that. The relationship we have with God, with a much more reliable understanding of God, is not giving up with our personal decisions, is being in dialogue, right? And so idolatry is always a risk, but it is a risk because it's easier. And some people prefer, right, the easiest answer, although it is misleading.
So there's an interesting sort of like parallel, right? Which is not just the idols where you accept the authority of an object, but there is also this sort of like tradition of authority, sort of like patriarchy, hierarchy in the history of medicine, where it's like basically whoever wears a white coat must be right, I guess. And so if you have a headache, the doctor says you have to take this pill. You take the pill even though it makes you addicted because the doctor said so. And that is sort of like something where ideally we get to a situation where we can sort of like live without these kind of dependencies, where we just shut up and do whatever somebody or some machine sort of like forces us to do. Now, there is two things which I think are very simple examples which every sort of like citizen should understand. One is our own data is in some sense too simple, and on the other hand, complex enough to create real issues. So let me start with the too simple thing. So if I have my genome sequenced, then everybody in the room has their genome sequenced, and we have some correlating information, we can use the genome to do some interesting stuff. So, you could find out that, okay, Max is like 3% Neanderthal, and for whatever reason, that means he doesn't like coffee or whatever, or it's not true in this case. Right, so these kind of things have been done, and it's much harder to go to causality than to have just correlation. But one of the key things about this is that a lot of this information is not in my genome sequence. It's not in the 100,000 snippets I get from 23andMe or whatever the company is, but it's actually a cross correlation across a matrix of like many, 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 many people who have been sequenced in all the different sort of properties. So it's sort of in the free information between the thing I measure, the frequency of or the presence of a particular genomic sequence, and the person. So it's neither a property of me nor is it a property of the gene, but it's actually a property of the sorting of the matrix, where if you sort it right, you find out there is like 100,000 people who are like me, who just happen to have these genes that like somebody had 20,000 years ago in the wrong cave. And so that is like the too simple part. But then the other thing is actually really, really simplistic. Like if you, like we're living in the age of CRISPR-Cas9, where you can cut out a piece of genome and place another piece of genome. So you can actually design organisms. This can just as well be viruses. And it's totally in the realm of possibility to actually create a virus that only sort of like attacks people with a particular sequence of genome. Like this is like, you know, I'm simplifying. It's probably much more complicated. Like you probably don't do this in a garage, but theoretically this is possible. But at that point, it is actually really, really dangerous to share your data. In the same way, where you could say, oh yeah, Apple has all my phone information, and if I listen to music on YouTube, it gets my cell phone gyroscope information and then sells me some stuff. But then, you know, if whoever has that data sort of uses that for, you know, Stasi or Nazi kind of stuff, then,
Correct.
you know, you don't need any cross correlation. It's just like, oh, okay, I want to kill everybody who eats Tostitos at 5 p.m.
Correct.
And right, then that's like what you're gonna do, and that's like as arbitrary as the decision may be. And so I think we should not say, you know, it's not that simple that like, oh yeah, people should own their data, but like we should always be careful, like how is that data used basically, and
Sure.
how can it be used? Because just imagine the situation where you're a country like Estonia is a country like this, Italy since the pandemic is a country like this. I think they hired somebody from ex-Amazon to do something like that, to centralize sort of the medical information. So every one of the people living in
Correct.
Estonia, you have like this central data bank, which is not biobank, but like healthcare data bank. And now, obviously, every citizen should have a nightmare that a right-wing party takes over and then just sort of like identifies people they don't like based on whoever their heritage is, which
Correct.
they may say, your
Yeah.
blood cracks, you need to go, or something like that, right?
Yeah. 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 Correct.
With this simple and sort of complex thing at the same time, basically.
Yeah. As always, and everything in real life. Still, if we needed to agree, right? If we need to write norms or to converge on practices, what is in common and what is different in these two cases, right? I think that what is in common is that the information that a biodata brings with it um, depends on the time, on the way it has been generated, the kind of biases it can has, right? So the context dependency in my language is the context dependency, right, of that specific information. Okay, so there is this point. Of course, and for sure, this has an implication in the understanding of the complexity of the system that will receive, at least in a metaphorical way, that kind of information. Also in the example of CRISPR-Cas9, right? Also in those cases, we can be very precise in cutting and bridging pieces of DNA. So we do know and we can perform perfectly at an engineering level, right, on those pieces of matter. But we do know that the living system, the cell, the organism, the organ, the species, right, in which that piece of matter at some point appears, won't react like a machine.
Yeah.
So it will be, the result will be again an emergent phenomena, which we cannot trace back only to that specific piece of matter. And sometimes we can control that evolution over 1 year, 2 years, maybe 3 years, but not forever, if we are talking about living beings and not about machines. So it's only a problem of scale, but it will happen. So in this sense, we are falling again in the previous scenario, in which there is a gap between that specific gene and the behavior, disease, risk to develop something of the real person in the real life. Okay. Said this, given this, there is the other aspect, which is true in both cases, I think, and which is the personal and collective responsibility in managing this information. Because, of course, it's not neutral, not at all. But that's where we have to be responsible enough and to make choices, because more and more everything is possible, technically speaking. It's possible. It's possible to create a synthetic DNA. It's possible to do a lot of things. It's possible. The point is, does it make sense? My way of reframing the issue is, does it make sense in scientific terms, in social terms, in ethical terms? Because we can do almost everything in terms of doing, in terms of realizing, okay? But we are wasting time, we are wasting energies, and when it won't be irrelevant, in many cases, it will be dangerous. And that's where our responsibility comes into the picture, right? And that's why I said that we need people, we need the scientists, we need young leaders, scientific leaders, able to think this since the very beginning. The human-centric story is not putting it's not a sort of greenwashing, sorry, about this, right? It's not a greenwashing, an ethical greenwashing of technologies. It's a serious, in my reading, in my understanding of things, is something we need by design to make that innovation sustainable. Sustainable not only in green terms, but in social terms. And
Yeah, that is, I think that is a really important thing that you bring in here. So there is this, like, sustainability has this sort of like, on the one hand, a super positive notion for people who are quote unquote green, and it has a negative notion for people who are sort of quote unquote conservative. While indeed there is a sort of like, you know, one of the my most latent experiences with this was an NFT startup kind of conference where, you know, NFT, this kind of like writing artworks into the blockchain kind of thing of 5 years ago. And so basically one of the interesting things was they said, oh, everybody can be rich, everybody can be part of this, it's super democratic and it's sustainable because, you know, it's like you have provenance for the data, it will be super disruptive and it will be a new business. So basically they made all these arguments for saying this can actually create disruption in the marketplace, which is obviously what all venture capital is about. In some sense, what you're saying is similar because you say we need young leaders, while at the same time, you know, isn't it like we're like, you know, I don't know, we're like 400 million people in Europe, and these people come in all ages, they come in all different shapes and forms, they're healthy, they're sick, they have long hair, they have no hair, they're male and female, they're something in between, they have a lot of experience, they have no experience at all, they're under pressure because they're in debt, they're under pressure because, I don't know, the mafia says they have to do X. So the question is, indeed, is young science leaders, like what's the solution here? Like this sounds a little bit like Deus Ex Machina, where like young people have the experience. This is to give another example. In 1999, there was the Art Historians Congress of Germany was in Jena, and they had Frank Stella, the artist, as a guest. And one of the interesting things was that he said, like, all digital art is erotic, And so he was basically against digital and computer art. And I just lifted my hand. It was like, but you got a feature last month in Wired explaining how your artworks work. And you basically take 6 cameras, you digitize it, and you use a computer to make these large sculptures. Like, is that erotic and is it bad? Or like, do you really not like computer art? And one of the interesting things in the discussion, there were like 500 people in the room, was that sort of the consensus of the crowd was that this is something to be explored by young art historians. In the same way that science fiction and computer games should be studied by young art historians. Whereas, like, yeah, at that point, like Stanley Kubrick was 70, the people who were doing computer games were like 60, and young people playing computer games, they don't know how computer games work. They know how they can play them, but they don't know how they're constructed. And if somebody wants to sort of like do something really profound with them, they probably need to know how they're constructed. And I think that is sort of something where I would sort of like disagree with you and say, actually, we need the whole crowd of everybody who is, and now here's a European word, a stakeholder, the people who are on the receiving end, like all patients, all possible patients, all the people who have knowledge. And if that person is 92 and not in the realm of getting an ERC starting grant, but has something to say, we must find ways how to integrate that voice, because that may be the most important person. Because, you know, if the disease is to be had between 85 and 95, somebody who's smart in 90 who goes through the whole thing may probably be the most important person in the whole room.
Yeah. Don't you think that precisely because of what you are saying, young generations, young scholars are much more vulnerable to this risk? And that's why I'm stressing that they, especially they need different training these kind of scenarios. That was my emphasis.
Okay, yeah.
That was my emphasis.
So how would that training look like? Is it something where, because right now people go to university and study the stuff they're interested in, which is also great. But you can tell, like, I studied art history myself and classical archaeology, and you can totally get away with not doing a single plot while getting a PhD. Like in 8 years, you don't use even spreadsheet software, which is sort of like, you know, the entry drug for systems biologists, I guess. You don't use code, while at the same time, right now, you probably cannot even get a position in these fields. Even in the humanities, you cannot get a position without having some sort of like expertise in digital humanities, which increasingly also includes use of generative AI, or at least knowing what it does and stuff like that. So the question is, how would that really look like? Does it mean people need to be, I hate to say the word forced, but what should be the requirements of people to learn all across the board, including in philosophy, and vice versa in biology? What kind of philosophy grounding should they get, basically?
Yeah. Well, forcing people is never good because it is much more effective working, following nature and not against, right, nature. But says, I think, well, what I think other colleagues think is that we should probably go back, and this is not a nostalgic understanding of universities, right? But we should go back to contexts in which people receive an integrated or even integral education. So in which they receive inputs, of course, they need to learn writing, and in this age, writing also means data and artificial intelligence and computing and computational sciences, but also having in their CVs part of their curricula other kind of not only lessons but experiences. It's probably a need of, we need to experience things, right? To experience beauty in a different way, to experience the good, what is good in our life. So it's yeah, I think that till it's only the last 2 century, actually, not even probably the last century, 150 years, that but before that, in Europe at least, scientists, not philosophers, scientists were called natural philosophers. And that was interesting, right? That was interesting because Bohr, Einstein himself, this kind of people really able to ask new questions, to see something new in the real world, to create new scenarios, able to to change a paradigm, right? To fight and to argue in favor or against something, where people trained in all these disciplines. And to me, it's important. The synthesis is always, it's not a problem of interdisciplinary projects. I think we need the people, we need a real person able to make that synthesis.
Yes. I actually, today in
That's
the
my
morning,
point.
today in the morning, I was on an airplane and I read an article which was sent to me by somebody I asked for it a couple of days ago. Her name is Katrin Leonard. It's about the interest in sort of mussels and shellfish in the history of science. And one of the interesting things that, like, this is perfectly speaking into what you just brought up, is this notion of natural philosophy was sort of like people who got interested in shellfish, which they found on the sea, which had an unbelievable, innumerable sort of like variety of form, of pattern, of texture, of colors, and like all this kind of stuff. And they basically, it boils down to something which she quotes at the beginning of her essay by a guy called Bachelard, who basically makes this point that imagination was sort of like confronted with these innumerable forms basically coming in from nature, where there is absolutely like basically it put imagine like how he it's difficult to translate from German on the fly, but so basically the idea is that imagination was checkmated by the sort of like physical natural realities.
Yeah,
And that, I think, is a really, really amazing sort of parallel to what's going on in cultural data analytics and what has been going on in systems biology since X-ray crystallography. Like ever since the 50s and 60s, we're sort of like having this exponentially growing amount of information being thrown at us, which is fully out of sync with
yeah,
all the theories we had previously.
yeah,
And my favorite simple example is frequency distributions in culture are all tailed. There's hardly anything that is average.
yeah,
Well, for 300, 400, 500 years, even 2000 years, we talked about cultural things as if there was an average Gothic cathedral, as if there was an average Greek philosopher, as if there was an average essay or something like that. And I think that is, sort of like the argument for cultural data analytics, like the main argument. There's so much stuff emerging from the collection, no matter how hardcore you are about your library classification and your ontology. If you start collecting tens of thousands of data points or millions or billions of data points with your classification system, what comes back will look very different than what you thought you're going to collect. And in biodata, that same thing is also true, which at the same time is sort of like cool because, you know, science, we can find something else, we understand something better than before, but it's also uncanny because, you know, reality will look very different than what we love to believe it will look like, right? And
yeah,
so that is, I think, sort of like, I think a really, really interesting sort of like, you know, sort of like counterintuitive, but at the end, the legitimization of a field such as doing data analysis also on biodata. And that has an implication, and data being shared always comes with the expectation that what people find out is unexpected, which can be positive and negative. But
Yeah.
if you don't do the measurement, nature will give you the same surprise by
Yeah.
giving you the cancer that you could have found out before, basically.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's for sure. Yeah, that's why I think, and I probably agree with other documents, European documents, on the importance, for example, of experiments, right? We have to create contests.
Mm-hmm.
The language, you probably are familiar more than me with the language of sandboxes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So contests in which it's possible to experiment,
Mm-hmm.
to see what's is coming, or what's the potential evolution, right, of in given context, blah blah. So we do need to experiment, but we do need to do that in yeah, this is the document, you see. So
Mm-hmm.
experimenting is important, system thinking is fundamental, participation is necessary, precaution, anticipation, and care. These are four, six um, items, right, that has been, yeah, at the moment, this is the best document I know in Europe, this one,
Mm-hmm.
which is
Okay.
governance in complexity. And it's more related with environmental issues, so sustainability. But I think that it's interesting applying, right, the criteria, the categories that they are using in the same, also to these other scenarios. It's an ongoing, well, going back to your point on imaginations, we do know that people are able to imagine something new if they already have in their mind something, right? It's impossible to imagine something, to have a real imagination without knowing a lot of things, without having seen things. So the the game we probably were used, right, to do when we were kids. But they, at least with my brothers and sisters, right, we were lying on the grass and looking at the shapes of the clouds, and
Mm-hmm.
imagining different stories evolving depending on how, no, clouds and the shape of the clouds were evolving. So um, again, I think this is for another seminar, but too much for today probably. But uh, briefly, I think that there is um, an exaggerate emphasis on the notion of creativity, and what is instead much more important for human beings to have a real imagination, to be really creative, right, in scientific terms, in artistic terms, is what, again, centuries ago, right, at least in Europe, we were used to call curiosity and
Mm-hmm.
studiositas. In Latin, it was curiositas and studiositas, no? The
Mm-hmm.
capability of studying, reading, listening before saying or doing things all the time, and the capability of asking questions more than being under pressure of giving an answer to everything. To my students in the exams now are much more related with asking relevant question than giving answers, also because ChatGPT is ready for that. So we can get all the answers, right?
They're 60% wrong.
Exactly, exactly. But the question is, explain now, please explain why this answer is relevant. For what?
Mm-hmm.
To what extent is relevant for that specific context, for that specific request, for that specific need, for that specific challenge. And that's something human. Machines do not have problems. They don't have values. And we have been building them to create islands of certainties, which are mechanic certainties, deterministic certainties by definition, because of that's what machines do, right? But making decision in an uncertain world is still up to us if we don't want to fall in idolatry, of course.
Mhm.
That's the
I-
ethical outcome of,
let- we
sorry.
we have 5 minutes left. There's one interesting thing which you have in this slide. It says types of measures needed. And if you go to the last slide,
The following one, or
yeah, this one,
okay.
where you see that these key principles of governance include experimentation, system thinking, participation, precaution, anticipation, and care. These are things that happen after measurement. And one of the interesting things is that the complex systems community, for a very long time, like many other fields of natural science and also humanities, looked down at quote unquote just observation. While in some sense, we're in a time that is very much like the heyday of astronomy, which at the same time we live in the heyday of astronomy with, you know, telescopes being shot into Lagrange points, where we can see things and we have numbers of data points that we never had, but this sort of like act of measurement is always sort of like taken for granted. It's almost like, oh yeah, digitization is not the research, but you enable the research of the humanists to then use this digitized stuff in the library. While obviously there is already part of the science in the digitization, such just like, you know, if you do spotted arrays in systems biology, they're not, that's, you can't order them at the, you know, at the technical support. It's a science by itself. While measurement as such, I think is super, super crucial because it actually enables exactly what you say. It enables asking new questions. Like the critique I got in the last 15 years often when I gave talks, and it was like, you don't answer our questions, you ask new questions. And it was almost like, you know, it was an insult, like it was meant as such, like, why don't you answer the questions of regular art historians? Why do you ask these new questions? And I was like, yeah, because I looked at the data, the questions just came out of it. And aren't you interested in these questions either? And so I think that is sort of something which like this sort of like mining for questions via measurement of stuff, which you don't know what it is, I think is a really interesting thing. Like think about cultural heritage. Is it the stuff that is already registered by UNESCO? Is it the stuff that is already in a museum? Or is it all the stuff that is produced by people in a country? Like, you know, that may include things where you don't agree that this is high art, for example. But
Yeah,
if there is 2 million people who think hip hop out of Bologna is cool and graffitis are cool, even though other people think it's damage,
yeah,
at some point you have to realize there's 2 million people actually thinking this is cool.
yeah,
You don't need to think it's cool, but it probably is worth doing science about.
yeah. Yeah, and managing these different levels is part of our challenge, because if we leave this kind of scenarios to machines, they at some point we will end up with one answer, with one question, and with homogenized behaviors. That's a possible scenario, but not sure that's what we want, right? Because that's the end of any scientific reasoning, any philosophical question, any, I think also social bonding, because we were relying upon machines and not on common common sense of beauty, sense of questions, right? Common experiences, also new experiences. Machines
Mhm.
are not able to see what they were not looking for. Human beings are able to see and to go after something they were not looking for, and even understanding that what they discovered is different from what they were supposed to, right? Think of America, right? The discovery of America, think of many other discoveries. And the history of science is packed with examples like this. something we want to see.
I think that like this is a good final sort of like point to bring up is what you just said is of course right and intuitive. I agree. But I'm hoping that the audience goes out actually disproving us. Well, because there may be people who say, oh, I'm tempted to build that machine, who sort of like find stuff that it didn't expect and didn't want to. And that is, I think, a really interesting question, because that evaluating that at scale would be also interesting, right? And at the same time, the thing that you say, oh, we end up in this sort of like mono culture or whatever, I think that is a really interesting thing, where one thing that is not taught in primary school but should, which is information theory. Like if you feed stuff back into itself, what you're basically calculating is the shape of the room and not like the stuff that is happening in the room. And so that is sort of something which I think is becoming ever more clear. And there we're facing a situation. It's very much like everybody learned what exponential growth is in April 2020 during COVID. And now we learn what this means, that we sort of like feedback and average everything above everything, basically. So that is sort of something which is probably as much something that governance-wise we want to sort of maybe avoid, while at the same time we are going to experience because of the trajectory that we're on seemingly right now, and we need to sort of like collectively understand that.
Yeah.
We're out of time. This was a very, very exciting conversation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you, and congratulations for this kind of environment you are able to create and manage in complexity.
Let's see. I need to sort of announce the talk of next week, which is Teresa Hyde. And it'll be about cringe, the sociolinguistics of digital effects, which is quite cool, because she not only does sort of like work on this topic, but she's also somebody who does ad hoc cultural data analytics when it's necessary on the web to resist decisions of German broadcasting. Having things happening in 48 hours that typically take months. This is a quite cool kind of thing. So thank you very much, Marta. And
is it possible to receive the link to the next seminars?
I'll send it to you. Yes, we will.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, and congratulations again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.